17 men went into that camp on the Stuart River tributary in September of 1896. One man came out. I am that man. I want to be clear about that from the beginning, because everything else I write here depends on the reader understanding that I was present for all of it, and that I am the only person remaining who was. My name is Thomas Beale. I am 26 years old. I am writing these pages at the trading post at 40 Mile, Yukon Territory, in the second week of November 1896, by lamp, on paper provided by a Northwest Mounted Police constable named Drover, who has given me 3 days to set down everything I can remember before the account becomes official, and the language of the account becomes the language of official things, which is a language that leaves no room for what I need to say. I have 2 frost-bitten fingers on my left hand. I have not slept in 40 hours. I have eaten 1 meal today, and I cannot tell you what it was. I am telling you these things not for sympathy, but so that whoever reads this later understands the conditions under which it was produced, and makes their own judgment about its reliability. I believe it is reliable. I believe I have remembered everything correctly, because the things I am remembering are not the kind of things that fade. I was hired as an assayer in August of this year, recruited out of Ontario by a mining man named Carruthers, who had vouched for my methods to a camp foreman named George Aldrin, who was forming a crew for a winter gold operation in the Stuart River country. I had no particular feeling about the Yukon. I had been in 3 other operations in British Columbia and 1 in the Northwest Territories, and I was good at the work, and the pay was real. The contract was for the full winter season. I took it. I need to say this now, before I get to what happened. Aldous Fry called my name once, from the inside of the bunkhouse, as I went through the rear seam in the canvas wall in the dark. I heard it, and I ran, and I did not go back, and I have been living with that since the moment it happened, which was approximately 72 hours ago, and I will be living with it for whatever time is left to me after that. I am telling you this at the beginning so that you do not have to wonder about my character as you read. You can know it now. I ran. He did not come with me. I will come back to this. I will come to the night of November 13th. But I have to start from September, because that night did not come out of nowhere. It was built, piece by piece, over 11 weeks, and the building of it was visible if you were looking. And some of us were looking and some of us were not. And the difference between those 2 groups ultimately did not matter. We reached the tributary the 3rd week of September, 17 men working under George Aldrin, who was the camp foreman. The tributary had no recorded name in any document I had access to. It ran off the Stuart about 12 miles east of the main river course, cutting south through spruce forest, so dense and so old that the canopy pressed out the sky for most of the walking day, leaving us in a half-dark that smelled of cold resin and wet moss and the particular mineral smell of glacier-fed water. The creek itself was clear and fast and ran over gravel that Aldrin had been told about by a man he trusted, and when he took his first pan in the 3rd hour after we made camp and held it up in the light that came sideways through the canopy, the color in it was real and significant. I have been in operations where the color was good and the mood of the camp changed overnight. Men who had been quiet and functional, suddenly talking faster and sleeping less, and thinking about what their cut meant, in terms that were specific and numerical. It happened here too. The cold of the forest receded somewhat as a practical concern. The weight of the equipment that had taken us 4 days to haul in piece by piece stopped feeling like something to resent and started feeling like an investment. Aldrin ran the stamp mill for the first time on September 22nd. And the sound of it bouncing back off the tree wall on 3 sides of the camp was for most of the men the sound of something beginning rather than something intruding. I need to describe the geography because it matters later. The camp occupied a gravel flat approximately 40 yards wide, pressed between the creek on its east side and the spruce forest on its north, west and south sides. The trees came within about 25 feet of the canvas on the closest side, the south, and their lowest branches hung at roughly 10 to 12 feet from the ground, above the height of the camp structures, but close enough that in a strong wind you could hear them moving. The camp had a bunkhouse tent, a cookhouse constructed of rough-cut boards over a frame, a small equipment shed, and the stamp mill on a platform at the south end of the gravel flat. There was a log bridge we laid across the creek at the east edge of camp, and beyond the bridge was more forest, running east until it met a ridge we never went over. The camp was, in the language of men who work remote sites, a good camp. Aldrin ran it well. The food was adequate, the equipment functioned, and the foreman had chosen his crew with care, or at least with the degree of care that the available candidate pool allowed. I did not know most of the men before September. In 11 weeks, I came to know 4 of them in any depth, and those 4 are the ones I need to describe, because they are the ones whose choices and whose fates matter to what I am setting down here. The first was Aldous Fry, 31 years old, from New Brunswick, a driller by trade. He was lean and efficient in the way that men who have done hard physical work for most of their lives become lean and efficient. No excess motion, no wasted language. I had taken to eating beside him within the first week, because he was the kind of man who said what he meant and did not circle it. He kept his own counsel, but when he offered an opinion, it was accurate. He had a way of watching situations develop with a patience that looked passive, but was not. And when he spoke, it was because he had already decided what he thought and was ready to say it plainly. He is the one who told Aldrin in October that something had taken the snowshoes so that we could not run, and he said it without drama, as a statement of fact, in the way he said everything. The second was Rupert Voss, 52, our cook and provisioner. He was from somewhere in the Maritimes originally, and had been through more camps than he could accurately count, and he had the quality that long experience sometimes produces of extreme competence, accompanied by an almost complete absence of surprise. He had seen things go wrong in enough varieties and enough settings that new varieties did not alarm him in the same way they alarmed younger men. This quality served him well for most of the autumn and failed him on the night it mattered most, because what came to our camp was not a familiar variety of going wrong. The third was Henri Lapointe, from Quebec, 28, who was Aldrin's second. Lapointe managed the crew schedules and the equipment tallies and the camp records with a thoroughness that the younger men sometimes mocked quietly and would later wish they had not. He spoke Han, which he had picked up in a previous season on another river, not fluently but functionally, and this is why he was the one who translated for the man who came to warn us. He took the warning seriously. He told me so later, and I believed him. He also said nothing to Aldrin beyond his translation, and I do not know to this day whether he thought silence was the appropriate response to Aldrin's decision, or whether he simply did not want to have the argument. Either way, his silence was a participation in what followed. The fourth was Cassius Teal, 45, who was the closest thing to a naturalist we had in camp, though he was not trained. He was a laborer who had a genuine and careful curiosity about the animal world, and he kept a running log of what he observed. Tracks, sightings, sounds, behavioral notes. His notebook is the reason I can tell you precisely when the animals left and in what order, and I am grateful for it, even though the reading of it in retrospect is one of the more unsettling experiences available to me at present. Teal's notebook for September showed the normal distribution for the region. Moose and caribou tracks along the creek, marten sign in the deeper forest, black bear sign along the north edge of the gravel flat, common ptarmigan in the scrub at the forest margin, faint wolf sign along the ridge 2 miles east. He noted that he had not heard wolves at night, which he said was slightly unusual for the season, but he did not flag it as significant. He was a careful observer, and he recorded what he saw without overstating its meaning. The meaning came later, when there was no longer anything to observe. I will tell you now about Shah, and about the color in the pan, and about how those two things together produced November 14th. In the third week of September, a Han man appeared at the south edge of camp one morning, while most of the crew was at the creek. He was perhaps 50 years old, dressed for travel, and he had not come to trade. Lapointe recognized this, and came to find Aldrin, and I walked over because I was nearby, and because I have a habit of attending to things that seem outside the ordinary pattern of a day. The man's name, rendered as Lapointe could manage it, was something close to Shaw. He spoke without preamble, directly to Aldrin through Lapointe, and what he said, as Lapointe translated it to me that evening, was this: The section of creek we had built our camp on was already occupied, not by a person or a family or a band, but by something that had been in that part of the forest for longer than the Han had been in the territory. He used a word that Lapointe rendered as something like the one who walks with the cold, and he said that the thing this word named did not distinguish between people who came in hostility and people who simply came with noise and consumption and disruption. It responded to presence. It had been aware of our presence since we began hauling equipment through the forest 3 weeks earlier, and the sound of our stamp mill, which had been running for 2 days, was a form of statement that it would respond to in kind. Lapointe asked what form this response would take, and what the man recommended. Shah said the form was not something he could describe in terms that would be useful to outsiders, and the recommendation was to leave the creek and not return to it. He said this without emphasis or visible urgency. He was delivering a communication, and he had done so clearly, and he appeared ready to depart, having done his obligation. Aldrin thanked him and asked Lapointe to give him tobacco and coffee and see him on his way. When Lapointe asked Aldrin what he intended to do with the warning, Aldrin looked at the pan he had been holding when the conversation started, the pan with the color in it, and said, "Run the mill." He was not a foolish man. I want to say that plainly, because it is true, and because it matters. George Aldrin was experienced and competent, and he had a real basis for his decision. The color in that gravel was the best I had assayed in 3 seasons, and we were 6 weeks into a winter contract, and the snowpacks had not yet begun. He made a calculation that most men in his position would have made, and the calculation was reasonable by the standards that applied to everything except the one thing that was actually happening. I wrote Shah's warning in my assay journal that evening. Not because I thought it was necessarily true, because I thought it was the kind of information that should be recorded, one way or the other. I wrote down what he had said, and what Aldrin had said, and then I turned the page and recorded the day's color results. The color results were exceptional. I did not know then that the journal would end up being what it became. I will come to that. The animals began leaving in the first week of October. Teal noted the ptarmigan first, because they had been the most reliable and visible presence at the camp margin. They were there on October 4th and gone on October 5th, all of them. No gradual migration, simply absent. He spent an afternoon walking the forest margin looking for sign of where they had gone, and found none. Then the marten sign disappeared from the deeper forest over the following week. Then the moose tracks stopped appearing along the creek bank. By mid-October the bear sign was gone, and Teal told me that in 12 years of camp work he had never seen a bear leave an area of active food sources without clear weather cause. I asked him what he thought it meant. He said he thought it meant something else was there, something that the animals could detect and respond to at a distance that we could not, and that whatever it was ranked higher in the hierarchy of the local forest than a black bear. I asked him how high up that hierarchy he thought it went. He did not answer directly. He said he was going to start keeping a closer record of the sounds at night. The mules were the last animals in the immediate camp area. They were 2 strong mules that had hauled the heaviest equipment pieces through the forest, and they had been staked near the equipment shed on the south side of camp, which was the side closest to the tree line. Teal told me in the 2nd week of October that both mules had begun refusing to stand near the trees at night. Their stake lines allowed them about 15 feet of movement, and each morning for the past week, they had been pressed as far from the south tree line as those lines permitted, standing together against the wall of the equipment shed with their heads turned away from the forest. During the day, they were manageable. After dark, they were not comfortable. By the last week of October, they had become difficult to keep staked at all, pulling on the lines with enough force that Lapointe doubled the stakes. I lay awake on the night of October 11th, listening to the forest. I had done this before, not as a deliberate exercise, but as the ordinary consciousness that comes before sleep, attending to the sounds of the dark before the mind lets go. Every night since our arrival, there had been a texture to the forest at night, the small sounds of a living system, branches shifting, the occasional pop of tree contraction in the cold, some animal movement, the creek's steady presence. On October 11th, there was none of that. The forest beyond the tree line was completely silent. Not winter quiet, which has its own texture and presence. Something else. A silence that felt occupied. I lit my lantern and opened the journal and wrote, "The forest is silent tonight." Not in the way of weather silence or sleeping silence. Something more like listening silence, as though the absence of animal sound is not the absence of attention. I did not know then that this was the last quiet night we would have. The tracks appeared October 17th. Lapointe found them at first light, on his way to the creek with the water bucket. He came back without the water and went to Aldrin, and Aldrin came out, and Lapointe led him to the east bank of the creek, and I came along because I was awake, and the camp was small, and there was no reason not to. The tracks ran along the east bank parallel to the camp, heading north to south. They were bipedal impressions in frozen mud, each approximately 18 inches in length and 5 inches across at the widest point, with defined toe impressions at the leading edge. The depth of each impression was roughly 3 inches into ground that had been frozen solid enough to take the weight of a standing man without deflection. The stride length between consecutive prints was approximately 7 feet, not a running stride, a walking stride. 7 feet between steps at a walking pace. There were 11 complete impressions visible, running the full length of the east bank from the log bridge at the north edge of camp to a point about 20 yards south of the cookhouse. Whatever had made them had walked along the creek bank, within 30 feet of the bunkhouse tent, sometime in the night, slowly, without urgency. Aldrin stood over them for a long time. Then he said that someone had rigged up some kind of elevated frame to make them, as a prank or a misdirection, and Lapointe pointed to the defined toe impressions at the edge of each print, and said that a frame would not produce those, and that each print represented a single impact point consistent with bipedal locomotion of something very large. Aldrin told us not to discuss this with the crew in terms that would produce alarm. Lapointe translated this to me with his eyes rather than words. Voss filled in the tracks with gravel that afternoon without asking anyone's permission. He did not comment on what he was doing or why. He simply filled them and tamped them down and went back to the cookhouse, and nobody told him to stop. The open question, which none of us addressed directly, was where the tracks went. 11 impressions along the east bank, and then nothing. The mud on the log bridge showed no corresponding marks, and the creek itself was too fast and too cold to wade without significant noise. Whatever had made them had simply stopped, or had stepped somewhere that did not record its passage. I wrote in the journal that night, the tracks today. 11 prints, 7-foot stride, bipedal, 18 inches. Whatever left them was not in a hurry. It walked along the bank the length of our camp, and then it left no further mark. Cassius Teal spent the afternoon looking for where they came from on the north end, and found nothing. I have been thinking about the direction of travel, north to south, the same direction as the creek, as if it was following the water, as if it had walked beside us from upstream and stopped here to look. I stopped writing after that and did not know what else to put down. The snowshoes disappeared November 1st. We had brought 16 pairs plus 1 spare, all of them hanging on the rack Fry built outside the bunkhouse on the north-facing wall. They had been there throughout October, snow-dusted in the mornings, and I had seen them every day and thought nothing about them except that we would need them when the deep snow came, which the temperature was promising would be soon. On the morning of November 1st, the rack was bare. The lashings were still in place, cut or chewed through at the attachment points, but not torn or frayed in the way an animal worrying at rawhide would leave it. The cuts were clean at the top, and the snowshoes themselves were gone, all 17 pairs, without a single one left and without any mark in the 6 inches of new snow on the ground that should have recorded whatever had taken them. Voss found a scrap of cut rawhide lashing about 40 feet from the rack, near the south tree line. Nothing else. This is the moment when the camp broke into 2 groups, not loudly or dramatically, the way camps break, which is in the quieter division of men who have reached different conclusions about the same situation and can no longer pretend the division is not there. Fry came to Aldrin that morning and said, plainly, without heat, something took them so we couldn't run. Aldrin said, I don't believe that. Fry said, I know you don't. That was the whole conversation. I watched it happen, and I wrote it down that night, because it seemed to me like the sentence at the beginning of a thing, rather than the middle. We had new rawhide and the tools to make replacements, and the work began that week. New snowshoes take time to make properly, and none of the men assigned to it had made them before. The progress was slow. Aldrin said the new shoes would be done by November 12th, and Fry said that was 3 weeks away, and anything could happen in 3 weeks. And Aldrin said he understood, and that they would work faster. Teal counted the nights after November 1st in his animal log in a column he titled simply, Sounds. He did not try to identify the source of what he was hearing. He simply counted the distinct acoustic events per night that came from the direction of the forest. And he shared these numbers with me because I was the only person in camp who was writing things down with the same rigor he was. Teal's count, November 1st, 3 sounds. November 2nd, 6. November 3rd, 11. The sound itself was the cracking of frozen timber, not the small cracks of ordinary cold contraction, which are sharp and brief and point source. These were deeper, more substantial, the sound of large branches or young trunks giving way at a point several feet above the ground. And they came from different compass directions in the same night, not from one location, but from a spread of positions around the camp perimeter. Teal had mapped their origins as best he could by ear, and his maps, sketched roughly in the back of his animal log, showed a rough arc on the north, west, and south sides of camp, with gaps on the east side where the creek ran. I looked at his maps on November 5th and said, "It's staying out of the water." He said, "Yes, I noticed that too." The cracking escalated through the first 2 weeks of November, with a consistency that I found almost harder to accept than the alternative. If it had come and gone, variable and irregular, I could have argued it to myself as something natural, cold contraction and wind and the ordinary sounds of a living forest in winter. But it did not come and go. It came every night, beginning at approximately the same time in the early hours of the morning and continuing until roughly 3 or 4 a.m., and each night it was louder and more frequent than the previous night. November 4th, 14 distinct breaks in a 3-hour period, from 9 distinct positions around the compass. November 7th, 22 breaks, 12 positions. November 9th, I stopped counting. The breaks were close enough together that attempting to count individual events was no longer meaningful. On the morning of November 8th, Teal told me something in a low voice, away from the others. He said he had been tracking not just the frequency, but the pattern of the positions, and that over the previous 4 nights, the sounds were describing a circuit, the same rough ring around the camp perimeter, with the same gaps, completed over the course of each night's listening period. Not a perfect circuit, not a fixed path, but a consistent envelope. Something moving in a ring around us, at a walking pace, breaking frozen timber as it moved, for 3 to 4 hours every night. I asked him what he thought would happen when the ring got closer. He did not answer. I wrote in the journal that night, "The circuit is narrowing. Each night the sounds come from positions that feel marginally closer than the night before. Not dramatically so. Not in a way I could prove numerically, but close enough that I notice it, and Teal notices it, and I think Lapointe notices it, because he has taken to sitting at the cookhouse fire much later than he used to, and he looks toward the tree line when he thinks no one is watching him." I also wrote, "I will come to what we heard on the 9th day of November. I am writing this now before it happens, so that when I come to it, whoever reads this will understand that it was expected, and we still did nothing sufficient about it." Fry saw it first. November 9th, early evening, just after the meal, he went out to check on the mules. He was gone perhaps 4 minutes, and he came back into the cookhouse with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not alarm, not surprise exactly. Something more deliberate, like a man who has just received confirmation of a hypothesis he had held for weeks and is taking a moment to absorb what confirmation means. He sat down at the end of the table. After a moment, he said that there was something standing at the north tree line. He said it was between the 2nd and 3rd spruce from the left, when looking from the cookhouse door. He said he thought it was standing approximately 10 to 12 feet tall, though he was uncertain of this because it was standing in the shadow of the trees and the contrast was imperfect. He said it was thin, very thin, in a way that he found difficult to articulate because the thinness was not the thinness of any animal he had a prior category for. It was thin in proportion to its height, in a way that suggested the normal ratios between height and mass did not apply to it. He said its arms, or what he took to be its arms, were long. He said it had been still when he first saw it, and that he had stood at the mule post for a moment looking at it, and that during that moment it had turned its head toward him. That it had oriented its attention toward him the way a person turns toward a sound, with complete awareness, and then it had moved into the trees, into the dark between the spruce, and it had made no sound in doing so. The cracking had not started yet that night. That is the detail I keep returning to. It had not started yet. Aldrin took a lamp, and Lapointe and one other man, and walked to the north tree line. They found one impression in the snow just inside the tree margin, a single footprint of the dimensions we had first seen on October 17th, and then nothing further, the same as before, stepping from a surface that recorded its mark to a surface that did not. Aldrin stood at the tree line with the lamp and looked into the forest for a long time. Then he came back into the cookhouse and told Lapointe he wanted a two-man watch rotation established from that night forward, with a lamp at the center of camp at all times. Lapointe asked him if they were leaving. Aldrin said he had not yet decided. I wrote in the journal later that night, he has decided. He simply has not said it out loud, because saying it out loud means abandoning a claim with the best color any of us have seen, and that is not a decision a camp foreman makes lightly or without a very specific trigger. I think he is waiting for a trigger he can name, something more concrete than what Fry described, something he can put in a report without sounding like a man who panicked at shadows. I understand this. I am not certain it is the right calculation. I also wrote, Fry said it was thin, that the proportions were wrong. I keep thinking about that. Wrong proportions in a creature of that size suggest something that does not carry weight the way land animals carry weight. Something built on different engineering. The stamp mill ran the next morning. I do not know what Aldrin was thinking. I know he could hear it the way we all could. Fry turned his ankle on November 11th. He was crossing the log bridge to check the east bank at first light, and the log shifted under his boot, the way they do in overnight freezes when the bark separates from the wood, and he came down wrong and hard. By evening, the ankle was swollen enough that the boot was tight and painful, and he could not bear full weight. The replacement snowshoes were not done. I sat with him in the bunkhouse that night, and we talked about it plainly, which was our way with each other. He said his ankle would carry him if it needed to, but it would be slow. I said slow might not be sufficient depending on the circumstances, and he said he knew that, and that he had been knowing it since the first morning of November when the original snowshoes were gone. He said he thought taking the snowshoes had been a preparation, not an incidental event. I said I thought so too. He said, then whatever is out there can plan. It can identify what we need in order to run and remove it before we need it. I asked him if he thought we would still be here on November 14th. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Aldrin will wait until the decision is made for him. The next morning, November 12th, I went to Aldrin directly. I told him the color results justified the claim, but the current situation did not justify remaining on site. I told him one man was immobilized. The replacement snowshoes were not complete, and whatever was in the forest had been systematically reducing our options since October 1st. I used the word systematic. I said I believed we were being prepared, and I used that word specifically. Aldrin listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said that he had been in camps where men got scared of the dark and called it something else. I said, George, the snowshoes. He was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, 2 more days. If the shoes are done and nothing changes, I'll call it. I agreed to 2 more days. I wrote it in the journal that night, those exact words, 2 more days, November 14th. I did not know then that I was recording a deadline that had already been set by something other than Aldrin. That same night, in the bunkhouse after the lamp was low, I heard Fry moving at the bunk across from mine. I heard the quiet sounds of a man writing. In the morning I thought nothing of it. I did not know until much later, when I was out through the forest and across the Stuart River, and walking toward 40 Mile with the journal in my hand, that he had written something in it. On the last page, dated November 12th, in his plain, undecorated handwriting. I will write what he wrote later. Not yet. The cracking on the night of November 13th began earlier than it had on any previous night. Not after midnight, not in the early hours of the morning. It began at approximately 10:15 in the evening, just as the last men were settling into their bunks and the cookhouse fire was being banked. The first break came from the northwest, close enough that I felt it in my chest before I fully registered it as a sound. Not 50 yards away. Much closer than it had ever been. I was lying in the bunkhouse with the journal on the blanket beside me. I had been writing by the low lamp. I stopped when I heard it. A second break came from the east, outside the bunkhouse wall, within 20 feet of the canvas. A third from the south, near the equipment shed. All within the span of 90 seconds. The men who had been lying down were sitting up. No one spoke. The lamp threw shadows on the canvas, and I could see the shapes of men in those shadows, everyone awake and oriented toward the sounds, which is the oldest human response, older than language, the instinct to face toward danger. Voss opened the bunkhouse door about 4 inches and held the spare lamp outside and looked toward the tree line for 10 seconds. He pulled the door closed and threw the bolt. He did not speak. The expression on his face in the lamplight was not the face of a man who had seen nothing. The cracking continued. I can only describe what the escalation felt like from inside. It began as a pattern I could still follow, individual events with gaps between them that the mind could track and assign positions to. By the end of the first hour, that structure had dissolved. It was continuous, or near to it, a rapid overlapping sequence from multiple positions that surrounded the camp on 3 sides, north, west, and south, with the creek on the east providing the only gap in the ring. And the positions were close, closer than they had ever been, 20 yards from the bunkhouse. 15. The sound of it was enormous in the forest, enormous and deliberate, and the pace of it, the irregular but relentless frequency, had the quality of something that was no longer moving around the perimeter, but had stopped moving, and was simply standing and breaking things. Then it stopped. Complete silence. The kind of silence that follows thunder, where the ears have been readjusted by sustained sound, and the quiet afterward is a different quality of quiet than before. I counted. 10 seconds, 20, 40, 1 minute. The lamp in the center of the bunkhouse threw light on 14 men sitting in their bunks or standing near the walls, all of them motionless, all of them listening. One of the younger men let out a long breath and started to say something to the man beside him. Another man told him to be quiet. We sat in that silence for roughly 10 minutes. Then the sound came again from directly behind the bunkhouse. Not from the forest, from the space between the rear canvas wall and the equipment shed, a space 8 feet wide, the narrow alley of ground that ran along the north side of camp. Something was in that space, breaking something, and it was close enough that the sound did not travel before it arrived. Close. Immediately close. On the other side of the canvas wall. I looked at Fry. He was sitting up on his bunk. He had his boot on his bad ankle, I noticed. He had put it on at some point during the evening. He looked back at me, and his face was very still and completely awake. I need to write what followed with care, not because I am protecting anyone or preserving any particular version of events, but because the sequence matters, and I am working from memory that is 3 days old and producing images more clearly than it is producing linear order. At approximately midnight, the front wall of the bunkhouse moved inward. Not collapsed, not torn open. Pressed. Something pressed against the exterior of the canvas from outside, and the wall came inward, bowing into the tent perhaps 2 feet at the center before the internal frame held it. The wooden supports creaked under the pressure, loudly, a sustained creak rather than a single snap, the sound of a structure being tested rather than broken. The pressure released, and the wall settled back. The men nearest the front of the tent were on their feet. Several of them moved toward the rear of the bunkhouse. Aldrin came through the connecting door from the cookhouse, which surprised me because I had not known he was there, and he had a lamp in one hand and a rifle in the other. Lapointe said, "George." Aldrin looked at the front wall. He said, "Get back." The wall moved again. This time the pressure came from 2 points simultaneously, one at the upper left, where the frame met the eave line, and one lower, at approximately chest height from outside, 2 distinct contact points. The frame at the upper left groaned and the corner joint cracked, not breaking but shifting, and a seam appeared in the canvas at that point, a vertical split from the lower support beam rising to mid-wall, widening as whatever was pressing found the path of least resistance in the fabric. Through that split came outside air, cold, December cold, and through the split I could see the dark outside, absolute dark, no moon visible, the narrow alley between the bunkhouse and the equipment shed in complete blackness. And in that blackness, filling the split, for less than 1 second, a shape. I have tried to describe this accurately in my mind for 3 days, and I cannot get it fully into language. What I can tell you, it was tall, and the fraction of it visible through the split accounted for more than half the height of the split, which was roughly 6 feet of canvas opening. The arms, or what I perceived as arms, were at its sides, and they were long elbow joints positioned below where the hip would be on a standing man. The quality of its thinness was what I had tried to prepare for after Fry described it, but preparation did not help. It was thin in the way that things become thin when they are designed for cold, for long distances, for a kind of movement that does not require mass, and it was looking directly into the bunkhouse, not searching, not scanning, looking at the room in the particular way of something that already knows everything in the room and is simply confirming it. Then it was gone from the split, and there was a heavy, concussive impact against the cookhouse wall on the far side of camp, wood splintering, the cookhouse lamp going out. Voss shouted once, a single word I could not make out through 2 walls, and the sound of the bunkhouse frame under continuing stress. After that, I cannot give you the sequence reliably. I can give you images. Aldrin going through the connecting door toward the cookhouse, Lapointe grabbing his arm, and Aldrin pulling free. 2 men near the front of the tent colliding with each other in the dark, one falling against a bunk. The pressure returning to the front wall, sustained this time, the frame shrieking. I was at the rear of the bunkhouse. I was moving. The rear maintenance seam ran from floor to eaves on the northeast corner, held by 3 wooden toggles on the inside, designed to be opened for equipment passage. I had noticed this seam in the 2nd week of September, when I was looking for a place to hang a lamp line, and had filed the information without knowing why. 3 toggles, top, middle, bottom. The top one was stiff, the middle came easily. The bottom had ice in the thread, and I burned my finger pulling it. Fry said my name. 1 time. He was on his bunk. He had not stood. He was looking at me and I was looking at him, and the distance between us was approximately 15 feet across the floor of the bunkhouse, and it was the longest 15 feet I have ever been unable to cross. I went through the seam. I came out into the narrow alley on the north side of camp, between the rear wall and the equipment shed, into the cold and the dark. I turned north toward the tree line and I ran. I want to say there was a calculation, that I assessed the distance between us and my ability to get him out, and the time available, and reached a conclusion. There was no calculation. There was the open canvas behind me, and the dark ahead, and Fry's name still audible in my ears, and my legs already moving. A man does not think in those seconds. A man does what his body has already decided, and my body had decided to run, and I ran. And what I left behind me was Aldous Fry, with a turned ankle and a distance I could not cross, and a name he said once. Once. I ran north through the spruce for what I believe was 4 or 5 minutes before my lungs stopped me. Not my legs, my lungs. I collapsed against a spruce trunk and pressed my back to it, and stood in the forest in the dark with my chest working, and my hands shaking, and the journal in my hand. I do not know when I picked it up. I do not have any memory of reaching for it. It was simply there, in my right hand, when I stopped running, which means I carried it through the rear seam and through the alley and across the northern edge of camp into the forest without knowing I was doing it. I stood against the spruce trunk and listened for perhaps an hour. The temperature was severe, well below zero, and I was in my work clothes without a pack or a lamp. I had the coat I had been wearing in the bunkhouse and my hat and my boots, and nothing else except the journal. From the direction of camp, I heard nothing. After the first few minutes, nothing. Not sounds of struggle, not voices. Not the continued sound of the cracking, the sounds I had been hearing for 11 nights. All of it, absent. The silence that came back was the silence I had noticed on October 11th. The occupied silence, the listening silence. And it had texture to it, now that I cannot put into words except to say that it did not feel empty. I began walking north, keeping the stars where I could see them through the canopy. The creek was on my right, eastward, and I used the sound of the water to keep my bearings. The forest floor was rough going, no trail, the snow deep between the root systems and deceptive over the ground hollows, and I fell twice in the first hour. I was cold in a way that was becoming dangerous within the first 2 hours, and I kept walking because walking was the only option available to me. I thought about Fry's name as I walked. I replayed the 15 feet across the bunkhouse floor more times than I could count before I reached the Stuart River. I have not been able to stop replaying it since. I reached the main river 8 hours after leaving the camp. I followed the river west. I did not look back. When I arrived at 40 Mile, I was frostbitten on 2 fingers of my left hand and walking on the momentum of walking rather than any remaining feeling in my legs. Constable Drover brought me inside and gave me food and hot water and looked at my fingers and said I would probably keep them. He did not ask me many questions that first day. He gave me paper and said I should write while I could remember everything. He said this like a man who did not entirely believe that what I would write would constitute an official record rather than a confusion, but he gave me the paper and the lamp, and that is what matters. I want to account for the journal. It is a leather-bound assay record, octavo size, approximately 200 pages, 3/4 full. Its cover is stained with spruce resin along the spine from when I pressed through the canvas seam, and there is a crease across the middle from where I held it against my chest on the walk through the forest. The last dated assay entry is November 13th, the morning before the night. The color results on that page are the best we recorded all season. I have thought about this, about the fact that the camp was worth staying for by any reasonable measure, and I have decided that I do not find it ironic. I find it the mechanism. It was the color that kept us there, and it was staying there that produced the situation, and the situation is what it was. After the last assay entry, on a page I had left blank for continuation, there is an entry in a different hand. It is dated November 12th, 2 days before. It is written in Fry's plain, careful script, and it says, "Thomas, if you read this, it means you got out, and I did not. I am not writing this in despair. I want you to know that. I am writing it as plain information, so there is no confusion later about my state of mind on this date. The ankle is what it is. Tell my sister in Moncton. Her name is May. Tell her the ankle wasn't the reason I stayed. That is the complete entry." He signed it with his initials, AF, and underlined them. I have read this 6 times since I came out of the forest. I have each time understood that the last sentence is the most important one. He did not stay because the ankle prevented him from leaving. He stayed because leaving had not been offered as an option by the time it would have mattered, and because by the time it was offered as a personal option to each man individually, without the group, there was not enough time. He knew this was coming. He knew it before I allowed myself to know it, and he wrote me this note so I would not spend the rest of my life wondering whether I should have done more to get him out earlier. He is telling me that earlier was not something I alone controlled. I understand what he was doing. I accept the gift of it. I am also going to spend the rest of my life with his name in my ears anyway. There are things I know now, in the clarity that comes after. I will write them plainly. I know that the Han Man Shao came to our camp in September and told us in good faith that the land we had built on was occupied by something that would respond to our presence, and that we thanked him and gave him tobacco and coffee and dismissed what he said because the color in the gravel was very good. This is not a uniquely terrible decision. It is a common decision, made by men who have a reasonable basis for their priorities and no framework for the alternative. I include myself in this. I wrote the warning down, and I went back to assaying, and I felt that writing it down was a form of due diligence. I know that the process of our being confined to that camp was not accidental. The snowshoes went missing on November 1st, after the animals had been gone for 3 weeks, after the tracks appeared on October 17th. This was not a bear taking something useful. This was a deliberate removal of our primary escape mechanism, timed to coincide with the arrival of deep snow, and executed so cleanly that it left no trace in the fresh snowfall that should have shown us everything. Whatever did that understood what snowshoes are for. Whatever did that knew that we would need them and removed them at the point when replacing them would require exactly the time that we did not have. I know that the escalation from the first night of cracking on November 4th to the night of November 13th was not random. It was 11 nights of narrowing range and increasing frequency, a ring that contracted each night by a margin too small to be definitively measured, but too consistent to be dismissed. Something that had been watching us from the tree line in the first week of September was by the second week of November standing in the 8-foot alley between our bunkhouse and our equipment shed. I know that one man came out. I know why. Not because I was faster than the others, or braver than the others, or because I happened to know about the maintenance seam in the rear wall of the bunkhouse. I came out because Fry said my name and I made a choice, and the choice was to run, and I have been running ever since, in the sense that running is the thing I do in every moment when I am not writing this account, because writing this account is the only thing that makes the running stop. The journal is on the table. The lamp is getting low. Outside in 40 Mile, the temperature is dropping toward whatever this night's floor will be, and the spruce forest across the river is a solid black wall against the slightly lighter dark of the sky. I have been sitting here for a long time listening to that forest, listening for the cracking. I have not heard it, not tonight, but I have begun, in the last half hour, to listen in a way I was not listening before I came to this table. I am going to close the journal now and try to sleep. I am going to try very hard. In the morning, I will speak with Constable Drover and tell him where the camp was and what remains there, and let him decide what to put in his report, understanding that his report will say something different than what I have written here. Both records will exist. This one will be more accurate. I owe Aldous Fry a letter to his sister in Moncton. I will write it tomorrow. I am going to tell her that her brother was the clearest thinking man in that camp by the end, and that he knew what was happening before the rest of us admitted it, and that the choice he made when the night came was a choice rather than a failure of ability, and that he was not afraid, or at least that he did not look it. That last part is true. He was sitting up on his bunk looking at me with his boot on, and he was not afraid. He was looking at me the way he looked at everything, with the patience of a man who has already made his calculation and is waiting to see if it was right. I think his calculation was that I would come back. I think he held that in his mind right up until the moment when it was clear that I would not. I am going to keep this journal. There is no one else to give it to, no office or archive that would receive it as what it is, rather than as the confusion of a man who walked out of a winter forest alone. It is mine, and it is Fry's, and it is the only thing from that camp that exists anywhere except in my memory. I will write in it every day for as long as I can, not about what happened on the Stuart River, about ordinary things, work and weather, and the price of provisions, and the events of the days as they come. I will fill the remaining pages with ordinary life. I do not expect that to help, but I am going to try.